All right, get ready to explore because today we're taking a deep dive into you. Well, not you specifically, but, the human body, the amazing machine we all share. You sent over some fascinating bits from a first look at anatomy, so I'm guessing you're ready to get into the nitty-gritty of what makes us tick.
Well, and what better place to start than with the history of how we even came to understand this
Yeah.
incredible machine, right? It's a wild ride.
When I was looking through the material you sent, it really struck me how interconnected the study of anatomy has been with art, especially early on. I mean, everyone's seen those amazingly detailed anatomical drawings by Leonardo da Vinci, but the text mentions that he wasn't just drawing these things for the sake of science, he was actually dissecting bodies to become a better artist.
Oh, absolutely. He was obsessed with getting the human form down perfectly.
Uh,
And he knew to do that, he needed to understand what was going on beneath the skin, right? The muscles, the bones, all the things that give the body its shape and allow it to move.
It's kind of mind blowing when you think about it. I mean, he was dissecting bodies in secret, going against what a lot of people believed at the time, all to improve his art. Talk about dedication.
Right. And it definitely paid off.
Yeah.
His anatomical studies are what allowed him to create such incredibly lifelike art, not just beautiful, but anatomically accurate, which was unheard of back then.
Speaking of revolutionary, the text also mentions this guy, Andreas Vesalius. He basically threw out the old anatomical rule book with his own book, De Humani Corporis Fabrica. He was all about hands on learning, wasn't he?
Totally. Vesalius was a huge advocate for learning anatomy through actually doing it, through observation and dissection, not just reading old texts, which, let's be honest, were often full of mistakes.
Then he didn't just point out those mistakes, he went ahead and fixed them. Big time. I read that one of the biggest misconceptions he overturned had to do with the human jawbone.
Oh, yeah. For centuries, people thought the jawbone was two separate bones based on, well, animal anatomy, mostly. But Vesalius came along, did some very careful dissections, and boom, proved that it's actually a single bone in humans.
Wow. Can you imagine having to be the one to challenge hundreds of years of accepted knowledge? His work must have caused quite a stir in the scientific community.
Oh, absolutely it did. I mean,
Yeah.
his book, with its detailed anatomical descriptions and those incredible engravings, all based on his own dissections, groundbreaking. It set a whole new standard for studying anatomy. And then there's William Harvey in the 1600s. He finally figured out how blood circulates. That was a total game changer, right? No doubt about it. Before Harvey, people thought blood kind of like ebbed and flowed like the tides and that the liver was constantly making more. But Harvey, through tons of experiments and just meticulous observation, showed that blood actually travels in a closed loop, pumped by the heart. Revolutionary.
It's amazing how these pioneers shaped how we understand the human body, especially with the limited technology they had compared to what we have now. I mean, wow, from those early dissections to something like the Visible Human Project today. It's unbelievable how far we've come in our ability to really see what's going on inside the human body.
Yeah. It's like having a front row seat to the most complicated, most incredible machine anyone's ever seen.
Mm.
But before we get lost in all the details, it's important to remember that this machine, it isn't just about like static structures, it's dynamic.
Yeah.
Everything's connected, working together in this intricate dance.
Yeah, it's not just about anatomy, the what of the body. It's also about physiology, the how it all works together. It's the difference between looking at a blueprint and then actually watching a building being built.
Yeah, exactly. A perfect example is the muscular system. The text talks about how the way our thigh muscles are structured, like the specific arrangement of the fibers and tendons, it directly affects how we run, how we generate power, propel ourselves forward. That's anatomy and physiology working hand in hand.
And it's the same with something like digestion, right? The small intestine with all its folds and like those little finger-like projections, it's designed that way to maximize how much nutrition we can absorb. Form follows function.
Precisely. And that idea, that principle, it applies to every single level of organization in the body, from the tiniest cells to the largest organ systems.
So it's like the human body is this massive jigsaw puzzle. Each piece, from the absolute tiniest chemical to the largest organ, fits into this perfectly specific spot to create this, like, single functioning thing.
And just like with a puzzle, to see the big picture, sometimes you got to start with the individual pieces. In the case of the human body, we organize those pieces in a hierarchy. We start with the simplest building blocks and then get more and more complex as we go.
Oh, okay. So, like zooming in and out of a map, but instead of continents and countries, we're talking like atoms and molecules, and then cells and tissues and organs, and, well, eventually the entire organism. Kind of hard to wrap your head around.
I know, right? But that's what makes it so amazing. So we start with atoms, the absolute smallest bits that make up, well, everything. You combine those in specific ways, you get molecules, and those are the building blocks of, well, life as we know it.
It's pretty wild when you realize something as simple as water, right? Just two little hydrogen atoms and one oxygen all bonded together, and it's essential for life.
Absolutely. And those molecules then assemble into even more complex structures.
Hmm.
Cells. Cells are the fundamental units of life. Think of them like tiny little factories, each one with a specific job to do that's essential for, well, keeping the whole organism alive.
I'm picturing these tiny little assembly lines, these miniature power plants, microscopic recycling centers all buzzing around inside us. But it's not just chaos at the cellular level, is it?
Oh, no, not at all. Cells are incredibly organized. They have specialized compartments and these mind-blowingly complex communication networks. And kind of like workers on an assembly line, cells with similar functions, they group together and form tissues. So muscle tissue, for example, is made of cells that can contract, and nervous tissue, that's made up of cells that transmit those electrical signals.
So if cells are like the workers, then tissues are like different departments, each one with a specific job to do. And like any well-run company, these departments got to communicate and work together, right?
Exactly. That's where organs come in. Organs are like those departments coming together to create a functional unit. Like, take the stomach. That's an organ,
Yeah.
right? And it's made up of all these different types of tissues that work together to break down food.
And then we go up another level on that organizational ladder to organ systems. That's where we have multiple organs working together. A perfect example is the digestive system, which isn't just your stomach, it's your intestines, your liver, pancreas, a bunch of other organs, all working together to break down food, absorb what we need, and get rid of the rest.
Precisely. And all of that brings us to the top, the highest level of organization,
Hmm.
the organismal level.
The grand finale, the whole shebang, the human body in all its glory. But before we get ahead of ourselves, I'm curious, what actually makes this crazy collection of cells and tissues and organs alive anyway?
Huh? The million-dollar question. Yeah, there's no easy answer. But the text highlights a few key characteristics that all living things share.
Right, so it's more than just breathing and eating, although those are definitely important.
Yeah, for sure. So first up, we've got organization. All living organisms, from the simplest single-celled bacteria to us complex multicellular animals, we all have this insane level of internal order.
So it's about more than just physical arrangement then.
Right. It's about how all those pieces and parts interact, how they work together in this coordinated way to keep the organism running.
Gotcha. So organization is key. What else makes something alive?
Well, all living things need energy. We've got to keep the lights on, right? That's where metabolism comes in.
Right, and our bodies are amazing at taking fuel, like the food we eat, and turning it into energy we can actually use. But it's more than just creating energy, right?
Oh, for sure. Metabolism is all the chemical reactions happening inside an organism, breaking down nutrients, building new molecules and structures, even getting rid of waste.
So our bodies are kind of constantly breaking down and rebuilding themselves then. It's a never-ending cycle. And speaking of renewal, the text mentions growth and development as being key for life, too.
Absolutely. It's not just about getting bigger, though. It's about how we become more complex and specialized over our lifespans. Like, look at the human brain. It changes so much from when we're babies to when we're adults. All these neural connections forming, constantly adapting to new experiences. It's amazing.
That's mind-blowing when you think about it. All the changes our bodies go through, even
Right.
at the cellular level. And that ability to change and adapt, that's not just limited to us as individuals, is it?
Nope, not at all.
Mm.
Over many generations, entire populations can adapt, evolve to better fit their environments.
Right, like giraffes developing those long necks to reach leaves high up in trees, or animals that use camouflage to blend in. But that kind of adaptation takes a long time, right? Generations. What about the adjustments our bodies make every day just to stay alive, to keep functioning?
You're talking about regulation, specifically homeostasis. It's how our bodies keep everything running smoothly on the inside, even when the world outside is changing all the time.
So, like, our bodies have this internal thermostat making all these tiny adjustments constantly to make sure everything stays balanced, even when life throws us curveballs.
Exactly. Like, think about when your body temperature goes up, you start sweating to cool down. Yeah.
Right.
And when you're cold, you shiver to generate heat. It's your body working hard to stay in equilibrium.
It's like there's a whole marathon happening inside us all the time, making sure everything stays balanced, makes you appreciate the little things like, I don't know, taking a deep breath, enjoying a good meal in a whole new way. Speaking of meals, I could use a snack break.
Me too. All this talk about metabolism has got me feeling peckish. Let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll dive into the wonderful world of anatomical language.
Okay, brain refueled and ready to tackle this whole anatomical language thing. It's like learning a whole new language, right?
It really is. And just like learning any new language, it opens up a whole new way of seeing things, understanding the world, or in this case, the world inside us.
The text mentioned anatomical position. Is that where we start?
Exactly. It's like our starting point, our reference point.
Yeah.
Imagine like a figure standing straight, feet apart, palms forward, thumbs out. That's anatomical position.
So no matter who you are or how you're standing, when we talk about the body using these anatomical terms, we're always referring back to that same posture.
Yep. It's about all of us being on the same page, speaking the same language, so there's no confusion when we're describing where things are or how they move.
Right. That makes sense. Now, I remember from the stuff you sent over that anatomical language, it gets a lot more specific than just like left and right. We're talking planes and directions and regions, next level stuff.
Oh, yeah. It's like having a GPS for the human body. So let's start with anatomical planes. These are like imaginary slices, right? They help us visualize and describe the body's structure in 3D.
Okay, I'm picturing those 3D model kits where you can take apart the layers and each one shows you a different cross section.
Perfect. So imagine slicing a loaf of bread lengthwise. That's the coronal plane, also called the frontal plane. It divides the body vertically, front and back, or in anatomical terms, anterior and posterior.
So if I was going to give you a high five, our palms would be meeting along the coronal plane.
Exactly. Now, slice that same loaf of bread across the width. That's the transverse plane, the horizontal plane. It divides things horizontally, top and bottom, or superior and inferior.
Okay, so wearing a belt would be like sectioning yourself along the transverse plane.
You got it. Now, last one. Imagine slicing that bread right down the middle. Two perfect mirror images. That's the mid-sagittal plane. Right down the middle, dividing the body into right and left halves.
Got it. Coronal, transverse, mid-sagittal, like a set of axes for the body. But why are these planes so important? Besides making us sound super smart, I mean.
Because they're how we interpret medical images. Think about a CT scan. It's basically a bunch of X-ray pictures taken from all these different angles around the body, just like those bread slices we talked about. A computer then takes those images and stacks them together to make a 3D picture.
Ah, so doctors use these planes to make sense of those flat images and see the body in 3D, even if they're just looking at a screen?
Exactly. Now, once we've got these planes down, we can use directional terms to get even more specific about where things are within those planes. And trust me, it's way more accurate than just saying above or below.
Thank goodness for that. Can you imagine trying to explain some complicated surgery using just up, down, left, and right? Talk about a recipe for disaster. So instead of saying the heart is above the stomach, we use these anatomical directions.
Exactly. We'd say the heart is superior to the stomach because it's closer to the head, and the stomach is inferior to the heart because it's closer to the feet. It's all relative to that standard anatomical position.
Okay, so superior and inferior are like our north and south on the anatomical map. What
Yeah.
about those other terms like proximal and distal? I always get those mixed up.
Those can be tricky. Okay, so proximal means closer to the point of attachment of a limb, and distal means further away. Think about your arm. Your elbow is proximal to your wrist because it's closer to your shoulder, where your arm attaches to your body. But your elbow is distal to your shoulder.
Ah, okay, that makes so much more sense. So it's about the distance from a specific point. This is like learning a whole new language. But I gotta admit, it's kind of fun, like a secret code for the body.
And speaking of codes, anatomical language also uses regional terms to describe different areas, kind of like dividing a map into countries, right? So instead of saying that area between your chest and your hips, we have a specific term, the abdominal region.
Ah, so it's all about being precise, taking out the guesswork, which makes sense, especially in medicine. You wouldn't want your doctor mixing up your elbow and your knee.
Exactly. Now remember those anatomical planes we talked about? They come in handy here too. For example, we divide the body into two main regions. The axial region, which includes everything along the body's midline, so the head, neck, and trunk.
And the appendicular region, that's the limbs, the arms, and legs. Okay, I think I'm starting to get the hang of this anatomical lingo. But what about what's inside these regions? The text mentioned body cavities.
Body cavities are exactly what they sound like. They're spaces within the body that hold and protect the internal organs. Think of them like, I don't know, separate compartments in a ship, each one with a specific purpose.
Okay, so it's not just one big empty space inside us. That would make moving around pretty difficult.
Not to mention messy. The text talks about two main groups of cavities,
Hmm.
the posterior aspect and the ventral cavity. Let's start with the posterior aspect, that's toward the back of the body.
Makes sense. So what's tucked away in our posterior compartment?
That's where you'll find the nervous system, the body's control center. The posterior aspect has two enclosed cavities. The cranial cavity, which protects the brain, obviously, and the vertebral canal, which surrounds the spinal cord.
Talk about important real estate. Those are pretty essential for, well, everything.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now let's head to the front, where the ventral cavity is. It's a much bigger cavity, and it's divided into two main spaces, the thoracic cavity and the abdominopelvic cavity.
Wait, is the thoracic cavity what we usually call the chest cavity?
That's the one. It's the space inside your rib cage. And let me tell you, it is a busy place.
Ooh, tell me more. What's going on in there?
Well, it's home to two of the most important organs, the heart and the lungs.
Oh, right, of course. Those two definitely deserve prime real estate.
And just like any valuable treasure, they're well protected. Each lung is surrounded by a double-layered membrane called the pleura, and the heart is nestled inside its own little sac called the pericardium.
Ah, those are the serous membranes, right? We talked about those before. They're like the body's internal lubrication system.
Exactly. They secrete this thin layer of fluid that reduces friction. It lets the organs move smoothly inside their compartments. Think about your heart beating all day long without that lubrication. The friction would be a huge problem.
Yeah, it'd be like rubbing your hands together without any lotion. Not very pleasant. Okay, so we've got the heart and lungs, each with their own protective membrane, hanging out in the thoracic cavity. What else is in there?
Right in the middle of the thoracic cavity, there's a region called the mediastina. It's like the central compartment, and it houses the heart, the trachea, the esophagus, major blood vessels. It's a busy neighborhood.
Sounds like it. And what about the other cavity, the one below the thoracic cavity? You mentioned it earlier.
Oh, you mean the abdominopelvic cavity? It's like the name suggests it includes both the abdominal and pelvic regions. It's kind of like the cargo hold of the body, I guess you could say. All the organs that do digestion, excretion, and even reproduction, they're all in there.
Wow, sounds like we've got a lot more to explore. But for now, I think my brain needs a minute to process all this anatomical info. We'll be back in a flash to delve into the wonders of the abdominopelvic cavity. All right, let's dive into this abdominopelvic cavity. What's hiding out in this anatomical treasure chest of ours?
Well, it's less about actual treasure and more about those organs that, keep things moving, if you will, digestion, getting rid of waste, and yeah, even making more humans. But it's definitely jam-packed with important organs, that's for sure.
And I bet it gets kind of crowded in there. The text mentions splitting this cavity into regions and quadrants. Is that to help keep track of everything?
Exactly. Imagine trying to give someone directions without any, street names or landmarks. Chaos, right? These regions and quadrants, they're like our anatomical roadmap, a way to pinpoint exactly where things are inside this cavity.
So instead of saying, like, that pain just below my ribs, a little to the left, which could be a million things, we can use these regions and quadrants to be super specific.
Exactly. Like if someone says they have pain in their right lower quadrant, doctors immediately know, okay, we need to check out the appendix because that's where it usually hangs out.
Location, location, location. All right, so
Uh-huh.
tell me more about these regions. How do they work?
Okay, so picture a tic-tac-toe board right on top of the abdominopelvic cavity. Basically it. 9 abdominopelvic regions, each with its own name, and usually the same organs living there.
So, like a 9-compartment storage unit, each one with a label. What are we talking then? Who are the VIPs in this anatomical neighborhood?
Well, let's start up top, right in the center, below the breastbone. That's the epigastric region. Part of the liver lives there, the gallbladder, and some of the stomach.
Okay, makes sense. When I overdo it on the pizza, I definitely feel it in the epigastric region. What about on either side of that?
Those are the right and left hypochondriac regions. They're tucked up under the rib cage. The right side has the right lobe of the liver, and the left side has the spleen and a bit of the stomach.
Okay, we've got the top floor covered. What about the middle level of our anatomical apartment complex?
Moving to the center, we've got the umbilical region. It's named that because, well, it's right around your belly button. This is where most of the small intestine is and part of the transverse colon.
Right. Makes sense.
Yeah.
And on either side of that,
Those are the right and left lumbar regions. Right lumbar region has the ascending colon, and the left lumbar region has the descending colon.
so a lot of digestion happening in the middle floors. What about downstairs, the lower abdominopelvic regions?
Let's start in the center again. That's the hypogastric region, or sometimes it's called the pelvic region. That's where the bladder is, the rectum, and the reproductive organs, depending on if you're male or female.
Ah, so the pelvic region's all about getting rid of waste and, well, making babies. What about the last two regions on either side of the hypogastric region?
Those are the right and left iliac regions, sometimes called the inguinal regions. Right iliac, that's what the appendix usually is and part of the cecum. And the left iliac region has some of the sigmoid colon.
Okay, so 9 regions, each with its own set of residents. You mentioned quadrants earlier. Are those like the express route for figuring out where all things are?
Kind of. Quadrants are a simpler system. Doctors use them a lot for, like, quick reference. Instead of 9 regions, you've just got 4. Right upper, right lower, left lower, all radiating out from the belly button.
So if someone has a stomach ache, the doctor can use these quadrants to narrow things down, like a game of anatomical clue.
Exactly. Helps them figure out what questions to ask and where to look. Like if the pain's in the right upper quadrant, maybe it's the gallbladder. Pain in the left lower quadrant could be diverticulitis.
That's amazing. This whole system of regions and quadrants, it's like having a map and compass for our insides. But speaking of seeing what's going on inside us, the text also mentioned some incredible imaging techniques. We can see inside the body without, like, cutting it open.
Right. We've come a long way from just doing dissections. Now with all this technology, we can see things that would blown people's minds 100 years ago.
Like having X-ray vision, only better.
Totally. Take x-rays, for example. They've been around forever, and we still use them all the time, checking for broken bones, looking for pneumonia in the lungs.
So how do X-rays actually work? Is it like shining a super powerful flashlight through the body?
It's a little more complicated than that. It uses a type of electromagnetic radiation that can pass right through you. Different tissues absorb different amounts of the radiation, and that creates an image, like on a special film or a detector. Denser things like bones, they show up white on the image, and softer tissues like lungs are darker.
So it's like a shadow puppet show, but with your insides. Pretty cool. But what about those 3D images you see sometimes, like from CT scans? Those seem way more detailed than a regular X-ray.
CT scans, short for computed tomography, those are like x-rays on steroids. Instead of one beam, a CT scanner uses a rotating X-ray source, so it takes pictures from all these different angles as it spins around you.
Ah, so it's like taking those anatomical planes we talked about and capturing them from all sides.
Yep. And then a computer takes all those images and puts them together to create these like super detailed cross-sections, like those anatomical bread slices, remember, but way more detailed. Those slices can then be stacked together to make a 3D image. It gives doctors a much clearer picture than a regular X-ray can.
So you're basically taking a virtual tour through the body. What kind of things do they use CT scans for?
Oh, tons of things. They're really good at diagnosing all sorts of problems. Tumors, internal injuries, bone fractures, even strokes. And they can help guide biopsies or other procedures.
Wow, amazing. But what about those times when they need to see even more detail, especially when it comes to soft tissues? I remember the text mentioned MRI too, right?
Definitely. MRI, magnetic resonance imaging. Another really powerful technique lets us see the body in amazing detail, but it works completely differently than X-rays or CT scans. Instead of radiation, MRI uses a strong magnetic field and radio waves to create pictures.
Wait, a magnetic field? Like they stick you inside a giant magnet?
Pretty much. Sounds
Huh.
scarier than it is. It's totally painless. The magnetic field lines up all the water molecules in your body, and then when they send radio waves through, those aligned molecules give off signals. The scanner picks up those signals, and boom, you've got an image.
Okay, so why go through all that? What's the benefit of MRI over the other types of imaging?
MRI is the best for looking at soft tissues. So your brain, muscles, ligaments, tendons, even the heart, it can tell the difference between all those different types of soft tissue, which makes it perfect for diagnosing all kinds of things: torn ligaments, herniated discs, brain tumors, even multiple sclerosis.
Wow. It's amazing what we can do with magnets these days. But there was one more imaging technique in the text that I thought was especially wild. PET scans. Aren't those like the rock stars of the imaging world?
They're definitely up there.
Yeah.
PET key scans, positron emission tomography.
Ah.
They let us see not just the structure of things, but how they're functioning.
Wait, so you can actually see organs working? Like a live performance going
Mhm.
on inside the body. How is that even possible?
So they inject a tiny bit of this radioactive tracer into the bloodstream. Usually it's some kind of sugar. And different cells in the body absorb that tracer. The more active a cell is, the more tracer it takes up. And then as that tracer breaks down, it emits these things called positrons, and the scanner detects those, which creates images that show which tissues are the most active.
So, like if someone was having heart problems, you could use a PET scan to see which parts of the heart muscle weren't getting enough blood flow.
Exactly. And because cancer cells are usually more active than regular cells, PT scans are great for detecting cancer and seeing if it's spreading.
That's incredible. It's like watching the human body at work, down to the tiniest level. This deep dive into anatomy has been quite a journey, exploring the body from the inside out, uncovering hidden anatomical treasures, even learning how to speak the language of anatomy.
And we've just scratched the surface. There's always something new to discover when it comes to the human body.
It really makes you appreciate how complex and just how amazing this biological machine we call home really is. Until next time, keep exploring the wonders of your own inner universe. There's always more to discover.